In this lecture, we will be covering Chapter 12 of your statistics textbook, Basic Research Principles. Research is the search toward the solution of problems. It answers questions that you or others may have, and it calls attention to theories that may be helpful in predicting future experiences. Research is done in many fields and may be done a variety of ways. Health research covers the wide gamut of lab research, clinical trials, and public health issues. This chapter covers the basic types of research and the steps in the research process, including data collection techniques and different types of samples. There are generally two types of research. In basic research, the investigator is not concerned with the immediate applicability of his or her results, but rather tries to look for understanding of natural processes. In applied research, the investigator has some kind of application in mind and wants to discover information about it that can be used to solve a problem or in some way contribute to society. Research methodology is the study of different types of research methods. At a higher and more general level, researchers in research methodology have described two overarching approaches to research, and those are qualitative and quantitative approach. Qualitative research describes events, persons, and so on without the use of numerical data. An example of qualitative research could be interviews with health information practitioners to determine whether their past healthcare experiences affected their decision to enter the health information field. Qualitative research consists of interviews, observation, and written documents that can be used individual or in combination. Quantitative research uses quantitative methods or numbers to describe a study, including some comparison of the population and statistical analysis to describe the results. Quantitative research consists of observations, experiments, and surveys. Table 12.1 in your textbook does illustrate some characteristics of quantitative and qualitative research. Although there are many descriptions on the types of research available in textbooks and different articles, most will agree that the research process involves these 6 steps. Number 1, define the problem. Number 2, review the literature. Number 3, design the research. Number 4, collect the data. Number 5, analyze the data. And finally, 6, draw our conclusions. Problem definition refers to forming a question regarding a topic you would like to study. The most important thing is to be clear about what you want to study. Often an analysis of historical data or secondary information has gone into the problem definition. Historical data analysis simply means looking at the past to see what has been done before, to try and prevent reinventing the wheel. In previous research, an investigator may have already made recommendations for future studies. Problems may be broken down into subcomponents or smaller problems. In Figure 12.1 in your textbook, that gives an example of a problem and then its possible subcomponents. The definition may also define the scope of the study, that is, who or what will be included in the study. For example, a study that includes hospitals may be defined as only hospitals with less than 100 beds. Or if we're looking at patients, we may look only at patients who are age 60 and over, or maybe we'll study only females. A literature review is an investigation of all the information about a topic. It's important to start any study with a review of literature on the research you want to conduct for 3 important reasons. Number 1 is to determine if research has already been done on the question. Number 2, to determine if any data sources can be used in your study. And number 3, to help you make hypotheses, to help them be more specific. There are many sources of previous research. Some could include journals, books, conference presentations, interviews, online databases, and the list could go on. There are several types of research design, and those are listed on this slide. We will go into each one of those in the next few slides. Exploratory research is often undertaken when a problem is not very clearly defined. This type of research allows the researcher to study a problem and gather information. It may generate a hypothesis. Exploratory research is generally informal and relies on literature reviews and informal discussions with others to find out more about the problem. Although exploratory research may not help answer the problem, it can provide some insight. Historical research involves an investigation and analysis of past events. This type of research also allows the researcher to apply previous researchers' experience and conclusions as part of the current practice. Conclusive research is performed in order to reach some type of conclusion or to help make a decision. This type of research may be done using primary research, and that is data collected specifically for your study, or secondary research, and that is a literature review to see if previous studies can be used to answer your question. Secondary research may also include summaries of past works. There are 2 types of conclusive research that we will be discussing: descriptive and causal. Descriptive research, or some refer to it as statistical research, provides data about the population you're studying, including the frequency that something occurs. This type of data might include studies on the status of the composition of the HIM workforce, employee morale in a specific department, maybe coding accuracy, or even the extent of electronic health record implementation. The 2 most common collection techniques for descriptive research are observation and surveys. Causal research tries to answer questions about what causes certain things to occur. This type of research is difficult because there may always be an additional cause that we need to consider. Causal research uses experimentation and simulation as its data collection methods. Correlation research refers to studies that try to discover a relationship between two variables. A variable is anything that's under study. In correlation research, the strength of the relationship is measured, and there may be a positive or a negative relationship between variables. Correlation research only determines if there is a relationship between two or more variables. It does not determine the cause of those relationships. If a strong relationship is found, experimental research can also be carried out to determine the cause. This type of research uses questionnaires, observations, and secondary data as its data collection methods. Evaluation research is a process used to determine what has happened during a given activity or in an institution. The purpose of evaluation research is to lead to a better understanding of whether a program is effective, whether a policy is working, or whether something that was agreed upon is the most cost-effective way of doing something. Experimental research entails manipulation of a situation in some way in order to test a hypothesis. In this type of research, certain variables are kept constant, and an independent or experimental variable is then manipulated. Researchers would select both independent and dependent variables. Independent variables are the factors that the researchers manipulate directly. Dependent variables are the measured variables. In formal research, a hypothesis is formed. A hypothesis is a statement of the predicted relationship of what the researcher is studying. It is a proposed solution or explanation the researcher has reached through a literature review. More simply stated, it is the tentative answer to the question that we are studying. The statement of hypotheses is important because it allows the researcher to think about the variables and the type of research design to use in the study. The research tests the hypotheses, proving it to be correct or incorrect. The fact that a hypothesis is rejected, that means proven incorrect, does not necessarily mean that the research is poor, but only that the results are different from what was expected. The formulation of the hypotheses in advance of data gathering is necessary for an unbiased investigation. There are two forms of the hypothesis. The null hypothesis states that there is no difference between the population means or proportions being compared, or that there is no association between the two variables being compared. For example, in a clinical trial of a new medication, the null hypothesis is the new medication is no better than the current medication. A detailed discussion of null hypothesis is going to be covered more in Chapter 13. The alternative hypothesis is a statement of what the study is set up to establish. For example, in the clinical trial of a new medication, the alternative hypothesis is the new medication is better than the current medication. Data collection includes primary research, or the data that is obtained from observations, surveys, and interviews. It also includes secondary research, or the literature review or summaries of those original studies. Regardless of the data collection method used, the research must be valid and reliable. Validity is the degree to which scientific observations actually measure or record what they purport to measure. For example, if the researcher is using a written questionnaire to collect data, he or she will pre-test it by giving it to someone who may have been included in the subject population in order to determine if it is written well, clear, and inclusive of everything the researcher is looking at. Reliability is the repeatability of scientific observations. With reliability, the major question is, can another researcher produce the study using similar instruments and get similar results? A study may be reliable but not valid. That is, a study may be able to be replicated and still not answer the research question. The type of data collection technique used depends on the type of research the investigator wishes to conduct. If the researcher wants to establish a causal relationship, they should conduct one of the experimental studies. However, if the researcher is breaking new ground in a poorly understood area of practice, they may want to consider an exploratory study in a qualitative design. Some examples of data collection methods include surveys. The survey method gathers data from a relatively large number of cases at a particular time. Surveys can include interviews and questionnaire surveys. In either case, the questions should be well thought out to ensure that they answer the question of the study. The questions can be restricted or closed-ended when the investigator only wants certain answers. For example, yes or no are closed-ended. It's a good idea to provide for an other category that would permit respondents to indicate what might be their most important response, one that the questionnaire had not anticipated. Open-ended or unrestricted questions allow the participant to express a freer response in his or her own words. Open-ended questionnaires, those can be difficult to tabulate, and although they may be easier to write, it may be better to take additional time and write a closed form type of questionnaire. It's easier to tabulate and it's easier to interpret. An observation is used instead of asking questions. The investigator observes the participant. In non-participant observation, the researcher, they're just a neutral observer who does not actually interact with the participants. In participant observation, the researcher may participate in the actions being observed, but does try to maintain objectivity. Another type of observation is naturalistic observation. Using this method, the researcher observes, listens to, and sometimes converses with the subjects in as free and natural an atmosphere as possible. The assumption is that the most important behavior of individuals and groups is a dynamic process of complex interactions and consists of more than one set of facts, statistics, or discrete incidents. A position of neutrality is important in this type of research. Experimental study. This provides a logical way to answer the question, if this is done under carefully controlled conditions, what will happen? There are many types of experimental studies, and a complete discussion would just be too lengthy for this introductory chapter. It's a sophisticated technique for the collection of data and may not be appropriate for someone in the beginning stages of research. The instrument, also called a tool, is a consistent way to collect data. Many different types of instruments are used in research studies today, and whatever type is used should be the one that fits the purpose of your research. Researchers sometimes use instruments that have been published in databases, and occasionally they can publish their own instrument with the research. However, researchers should not develop an instrument until they've established that one does not already exist. If you decide to develop your own, develop the questions carefully and be sure to test them to ensure you're gathering what you need to answer your research problem. Another consideration in data collection is the selection of subjects for your study. For example, a study on health information departments in the United States could try to include every HIM department in the nation, but that would likely prove impractical and costly and time-consuming. So the next best thing is to use a sample. When chosen correctly, samples are considered to be representative of the population. Generally, there are two types of sampling techniques: probability sampling and non-probability sampling. Probability sampling uses some form of random selection. Probability sampling includes three types: simple random sampling. This sampling technique involves choosing individuals from the population in such a way that every individual has an equal chance of being selected. The simplest way to select a sample is to place names in a hat and draw out the sample. Statistics books also include a table of random numbers that can be used for random samples. In systematic random sampling, a systematic pattern is used with the random sampling. For example, if you were choosing from a list of patients discharged during the last month, you might choose the first patient randomly and every fifth patient thereafter. In this sample, choice of the first patient determines the others. Stratified random sampling. To select a stratified random sample, divide the population into groups of similar individuals. Choose a separate simple random sample for each of those groups, and then combine the random sample form for the full sample. For example, you may want to choose a selection by gender, by patients with private insurance, and those without, or separating hospitals by bed size. In cluster sampling, the population is selected from groups or clusters. For example, if the study includes HIM practitioners working in large cities, you would first choose the cities or the clusters and then randomly choose HIM practitioners from those cities. This is called a two-stage cluster sampling. Almost all qualitative research methods rely on non-probability sampling. Non-probability sampling does not involve a random sampling of the population, but rather it includes judgment sampling. In judgment sampling, the researcher relies on their own judgment to select subjects for the study. For example, in a study on health information departments in acute care hospitals, that are using electronic health records, the researcher might use their own judgment to select a specific hospital size for the study from among large, small, and medium-sized hospitals that do use EHRs. In quota sampling, the researcher first divides the population, as in stratified sampling, and then they select the number of subjects based on a specified proportion. In quota sampling, the selection of the sample is made by the researcher who has been given or decides on quotas to fill from the subgroups. In convenience sampling, selection is based on the availability of the subjects. Healthcare organizations that conduct research on human subjects are required to have an IRB, or an Institutional Review Board. The IRB is a committee whose primary responsibility is to protect the rights and welfare of research subjects. They're responsible for reviewing all research projects for approval or disapproval. They ensure that the steps are taken by the researcher to protect the participants. They review research procedures before the study is started and then randomly during the study. An IRB can approve, revise, or even deny research requests. Any research on a human must be taken with care to ensure that the patients are not abused in any way. It may be necessary to ask participants to sign a statement saying that they understand what is being asked of them. The researcher must protect the privacy of any and all research participants. Professionals who serve on IRBs generally have extensive education and experience in clinical research, so therefore most of those individuals do have a medical or doctoral degree of some sort. You may see an IRB referred to as a Human Subjects Committee or maybe an Independent Ethics Committee. The IRB functions as a type of ethics committee that focuses on what is right or wrong and what is undesirable in order to protect the rights and welfare of anyone participating in a research study. When human subjects are involved, researchers are required to follow certain ethical principles that guide behavior and character traits. Research ethics provide a structure for analysis and decision making, support and remind researchers to protect human subjects, and also to provide workable definitions of benefits and risks. A benefit may be specific to the individual or to others that may result from research. Risks are concerned with the probability or the extent of harm to the research subject. The IRB is responsible for reviewing research procedures before the study is started. They can approve, revise, or deny. Research subjects must be given informed consent. Informed consent is a person's voluntary agreement to participate in or undergo certain procedures. HIPAA, the privacy rule, establishes a category of protected health information, or PHI, which may be used or disclosed only in certain circumstances or under certain conditions. PHI is a subset of what is called individually identifiable health information. It includes what health information, or what healthcare professionals, typically regard as PHI. The privacy rule defines the means by which human research subjects are informed of how their personal medical information will be used or disclosed. It also outlines their right to access the information. The privacy rule also protects the privacy of identifiable information while ensuring that researchers continue to have access to medical information that they need to conduct their research. Investigators are permitted to use and disclose PHI for research with individual authorization or without individual authorization under limited circumstances. A valid privacy rule authorization is an individual's signed permission allowing a covered entity to use or disclose that PHI for the purpose of the research or what else is stated in the authorization. When an authorization is obtained for research purposes, the privacy rule requires that it pertain only to the specific research study, not to future undefined projects. The core elements of the privacy rule authorization include a description of the PHI to be used or disclosed, identifying the information in a specific and meaningful manner. Should also include the names or other specific identification of the persons authorized to make the requested use or disclosure. It should also include the names or other specific identification of the persons to whom the covered entity may make the requested use or disclosure. A description of each purpose of the requested use or disclosure. An authorized expiration date or expiration event that relates to the individual or to the purpose of the use or disclosure. The signature of the individual and the date should also be included. If the individual's legally authorized representative signs the authorization, a description of their authority to act for that person must also be provided. The authorization should be written in plain, understandable language, and a copy should be provided to each individual. Some facilities may also have a research protocol monitoring committee that reviews any research before and during the study to ensure there are no adverse effects on the participants. It may even recommend closure of research that is not meeting safety standards, does not have scientific merit, or is not meeting the goals of the research. The ideal sample size is one that is large enough to serve as an adequate representation of the population about which the research wishes to generalize, and small enough to be selected in terms of subject availability, expense in both time and money, and complexity of the data analysis. Some tips about sample size are included here on this slide. The larger the sample, the smaller the magnitude of sampling error. Survey studies ordinarily have a larger sample size than experimental studies. Questionnaires that are mailed can have a response rate as low as 20 to 30%, so a large initial sample is recommended. When you're planning to have subgroups from a study population, begin with a large group and make sure you have enough participants to make subgroups. Subject availability and costs have to be considered in determining your sample size. The investigator will try to determine what the best way to analyze the data is. There are a variety of stats used to analyze data, and most investigators do use a variety of techniques to describe the data. Two types of statistical applications are relevant to most studies: descriptive and inferential statistics. Descriptive statistics describes the data. Measures of central tendency and measures of variation are included in descriptive stats. These are also was discussed in Chapter 10 if you need to go back and review that. Inferential statistics allows the researcher to make inferences about the population's characteristics from the sample's characteristics. Analysis of variance, or those ANOVA tests and t-tests, are example of inferential stats that will be discussed in Chapter 13. Any conclusions reached from the study should be related to the hypotheses, or when using the qualitative approach, the identified problem. The results from each hypothesis should be described. Any limitations discovered during data analysis should be reported. For example, the study of health information departments that we talked about earlier studied one city. That may be a limiting factor. That is, the conclusion may not apply to other geographical areas as well. Research generally raises new questions about what else they can study in future research. The researcher should always include conclusions as to whether or not this problem is better understood or perhaps even resolved from their research. Stats can be very powerful. The easiest way to fabricate data is to simply make up numbers. As reported by the U.S. Public Health Service, this is what happened in the case of John Subdo. It was determined he fabricated results in the reporting of information in a grant application and in its first-year progress report. Another way to mislead people is to give misinformation. That is to make a claim that is contradicted by available statistical information. Everyone must check the facts before asserting information. Another common error that occurs is to compare raw numbers without adjusting the baseline. Statistical errors can also occur when a sample used in research does not represent the population, and that is called selection basis. Graphs can be manipulated to emphasize many different points, and that is graphical misrepresentation. Many statistical reports in healthcare settings are computer generated. When a statistical report is received, the HIM professional should examine it carefully and try to determine if the data is correct or is misrepresented. The HIM professional does have an obligation to follow ethical guidelines in statistical practice. Stats play an important part in clinical and healthcare administrative decision-making. Therefore, statistical data collection, calculation, display, and interpretation must be appropriate and accurate. To help ensure data quality, HIM professionals should really follow the IRB policies and practices at their facility. The American Statistical Association has developed ethical guidelines for statistical practice. They advocate for integrity in the professional work. Their guidelines include present findings and interpretations honestly and objectively, to avoid untrue, deceptive, or undocumented statements, and also to disclose any financial or other interests that may affect or appear to affect these professional statements. Any student or HIM professional who would like to be involved in research and who need to develop skills in research should Take at least one course in stats and research methods. Begin to read research studies in professional journals. Agree to work with a skilled health information researcher on a study to get experience. And learn how to present data effectively, both in written form and verbally.